Human rights have had a noteworthy impact on the lives of hundreds of millions of people over the last 72 years. They have helped change the behaviour of governments and enabled countries to be held accountable for upholding those rights. We all know that the United Nations has its flaws. The power of the veto often stifles the resolution of vexing global issues. But sometimes it is worthwhile to reflect on the successes of the United Nations. There can be no doubt that the progress of human rights over the past 7 decades has made human life safer, more just, and enabled us to live more enjoyable and secure lifestyles. For this, we must acknowledge the global success of human rights for its significance and for the ongoing work to ensure that all of humanity can benefit from them. I look forward to hearing from our prestigious array of speakers on human rights this evening in the face of COVID-19 and the global climate crisis, as well as challenges and opportunities for the Pacific region. We are delighted to hear perspectives from the Minister for Climate Change, the Honourable James Shaw, as our keynote speaker. Our Special Officer for Human Rights, Dr Paula Pereda-Perez, will moderate the seminar shortly. We will address the following specific topics: COVID-19 and its human rights dimensions in the Pacific region, COVID-19 and climate change, hopes and challenges for future pandemics in the era of global warming, climate change and human rights, opportunities to rethink our relationships with the environment. The Minister will be joined by other excellent speakers, including climate change specialist Dr Nathan Ross and Victoria University of Wellington Senior Research Fellow in Epidemiology Dr Mona Jeffreys. Prior to becoming an MP, James Shaw had a successful career working for large multinational organisations through to local startups, social enterprises and community organisations across Europe, New Zealand and indeed around the world. In 2017, James led the Green Party into its first ever term in government with ministers and was appointed Minister for Climate Change, Statistics and Associate Minister for Finance. In his first term, he guided the Zero Carbon Act through Parliament with unanimous support, reformed the emissions trading scheme to cut pollution into the atmosphere, and established Green Investment Finance Limited to stimulate investment in the low-carbon economy. All impressive achievements. Now, in his second term, James is focusing on specific measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transport, energy and agricultural sectors. He also has a new role as the government's Associate Minister for the Environment with responsibility for biodiversity. Please welcome the Honourable James Shaw.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us here as we celebrate this auspicious anniversary. 72 years ago today, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris. I know you know this already, but it is worth restating as we commemorate this anniversary. It was designed to sit beside the United Nations Charter as a roadmap to protect the rights of individuals everywhere. The international community affirmed that human rights are universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent, and apply equally without discrimination, something we ought to remember from time to time. It set out for the first time that human rights are the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace, and it forms the basis for international human rights law as we know it today. New Zealand supported the adoption of the Declaration in 1948. The principles enshrined in it continue to guide our approach to human rights, both internationally and domestically. In essence, the Declaration is about ensuring the well-being of all people. While the international context has changed, with complex global challenges like COVID-19 and climate change, the Declaration remains foundational for how New Zealand protects and promotes human rights, both at home and abroad. As a Pacific nation, New Zealand is deeply connected with our region by people, by culture, by history, by politics, and by shared aspirations. This interconnectedness of our Pacific and Māori histories demonstrates that our well-being is inextricably linked. In our work in the Pacific, we are guided by Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles such as partnership, protection, and participation in our pursuit of betterment of human rights. Together, in partnership with Pacific governments, we believe that we can realise a stable, prosperous, and resilient Pacific. Our pursuit of human rights in the Pacific is holistic, with a focus on protecting and progressing social and economic, civil and political and cultural rights. It's informed by our Pacific strategy and our International Human Rights Action Plan. We work in partnership with Pacific governments, Indigenous organisations and multilateral organisations, recognising that in New Zealand, we actually also still have very much work to do in the realisation of fundamental human rights. We work to protect and advance the rights of those who are, for reasons of prejudice or circumstance, not having their rights fulfilled. We work to ensure that all people can meaningfully participate in the realisation of their own rights. New Zealand's social and economic development support to the Pacific focuses on improving the well-being of communities as a whole, working towards fundamental rights such as education, health, water, and livelihoods all being realised. We focus on ensuring that the most vulnerable and marginalised are beneficiaries of this support so that no one is left behind. In addition, we also support the realisation of human rights for specific groups in the Pacific where there is the greatest need, reflecting focus areas that are set out in our International Human Rights Action Plan. We work to protect and advance the rights of people with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, and we promote their full inclusion in society. We do this in partnership with regional organisations like the Pacific Disability Foundation. We work to advance gender equality through preventing gender-based violence, providing economic opportunities for all, and promoting women into leadership roles. And we provide targeted support to reach those children and youth most in need. Now, COVID-19 is presenting unique challenges to the protection of human rights around the world, including in the Pacific. The pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities and disproportionately affected vulnerable groups: women, children, older persons, Indigenous peoples, LGBTQI peoples, and persons with disabilities. The devastating socioeconomic impacts of the virus have been felt around the world. And in the Pacific, the impacts of COVID-19 have also been complex and far-reaching. The closure of international borders and the global economic downturn have amplified existing economic constraints, and many Pacific islands are now in a state of economic crisis. Countries such as Palau, Tonga, Cook Islands, Fiji, Samoa, Vanuatu, where tourism sector revenues are a significant portion of GDP, have faced especially severe economic contractions this year. However successful the Pacific is at keeping COVID-19 itself out and minimising the spread of the disease, the economic and the social consequences are having a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable groups in the Pacific and deepening inequalities. Governments are under pressure to push for quicker economic recovery, which can come at the cost of environmental standards and ensuring equitable access to stimulus packages. As with many parts of the world, the enjoyment of fundamental rights, including to education, health, and life, is being impacted. Thousands of children are out of school with no ability to learn from home, and many have missed life-saving childhood vaccinations. Industries where high numbers of women work, such as tourism, hospitality, retail, and textiles, are amongst the hardest hit industries in the Pacific. Many women are now out of work. Women's overrepresentation in the informal sector means that in times of crisis, they may also have less income security and lack access to government support. and there is evidence of a concerning increase in gender-based violence in the Pacific, as indicated by the significant rise in calls to crisis centres. So, for example, in Fiji, there were 527 calls to crisis centres in the month of April, compared to 87 calls pre-COVID. Now, I'm saying this, of course, because, if you think about that commitment that we have to universal rights that are all equal, and how we have tried over the course of some time, to greater or lesser success, to be able to draw a line from that commitment all the way through to our work, it is being undone to an extraordinary extent by the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Now, like COVID-19, climate change exacerbates existing inequalities, which in turn undermine the realisation of fundamental rights. The same groups that are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 in the Pacific, women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, LGBTQI people, the poor, are also highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. In the Pacific, the increase in extreme weather events, such as cyclones and droughts, lead to increased food and water insecurity and increased infectious and vector-borne diseases. COVID-19 highlights the future risks of compounding global crises like climate change and pandemics for Pacific peoples. It's a wake-up call for us to do more, to strengthen global health security and also to take strong action to address the climate crisis. Unlike COVID-19, there will not be a vaccine for climate change. New Zealand needs to ensure that the response and the recovery to the pandemic in the Pacific respects and promotes the human rights and the needs of all. In an environment where human rights can be pushed aside, we must ensure that these remain at the forefront. A key part of this is working to ensure equitable access to safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines worldwide, including for the Pacific. To achieve this, New Zealand has joined the COVAX facility, which pulls investment at the global level to accelerate development and distribution of vaccines. Supporting COVAX is part of our commitment to ensuring that communities everywhere, including in the Pacific, receive the vaccines that they need. We've contributed $37 million to the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, of which $7 million will support the distribution of vaccines to developing countries, including in the Pacific. Reflecting our own domestic response to COVID-19, we've been partnering with Pacific countries to deliver a response to the pandemic which prioritises the right to health and to well-being. A prioritised health response is the basis of a strong economic response. At the start of the pandemic, New Zealand provided a COVID-19 financial support package of $10 million to the Pacific for health system preparedness, including medical equipment, personal protective equipment, establishment of quarantine and isolation facilities, and the development and implementation of pandemic plans. We also provided $3 million to the World Health Organization to support Pacific Island countries to respond to COVID-19, and a further $1 million for COVID-19 testing kits. The pandemic has reinforced the importance of information sharing and coordination with Pacific governments. Throughout the pandemic, New Zealand has prioritised keeping Pacific governments informed of our domestic response, including our risk profile, alert levels, and border settings. In addition to support for the health response, New Zealand has also provided $40 million worth of direct budget support to Pacific governments to help to address the economic crisis facing the region. A substantial portion of this has been utilised by Pacific governments to further strengthen healthcare facilities and to address the broader social and economic impacts arising from COVID-19. We've also provided support to enable thousands of stranded Pacific Islanders to safely return home. The pandemic has demonstrated that New Zealand's focus on realising the human rights and well-being of all in the Pacific is critical, and it must be maintained. As we work in partnership with the Pacific to build back from the pandemic, we will increase our focus on strengthening health systems and health security, including through the procurement and rollout of a safe and effective vaccine in the Pacific. Continue to build economic resilience to help bolster against future shocks, with a particular focus on economic stability, including the promotion of jobs. We'll work harder to strengthen the systems of social inclusion so that the most vulnerable groups in society can receive targeted support. This includes continuing to ensure a gender-responsive approach is integrated into all of our development assistance. We'll continue to support essential services such as women's and children's crises centres, sexual and reproductive health services, and mental health services. The pandemic has shown us just how critical these are in times of crisis. We'll continue to work with Pacific countries and leaders, civil society, regional organisations, and multilateral organisations to draw on the lessons of COVID-19, to take action on climate change, and call for others to do the same. A part of this is integrating climate change considerations into pandemic recovery support, and underpinning this is a human rights-based approach. Whereas COVID-19 is a sprint, climate change is a marathon, and we must ensure our fundamental values and human rights are our goal. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Minister, for your insights and perspective, and it's very heartening to hear again of what New Zealand is doing to provide support into the Pacific, so thank you for that. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the remainder of this evening's events. Dr. Paula Pereda-Perez is our United Nations Association of New Zealand Special Officer for Human Rights. Paula.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you today and our speakers. So now we'll introduce our next two speakers. Dr. Nathan Ross, who is a climate and environmentalist specialist. Nathan has been working on climate change issues since mid-90s, and it has degrees in environmental science and law. His career in central and local government and the NGO sector has focused primarily on mitigating climate change, particularly through sustainable energy. More recently, his work focused on adaptation through his research at Victoria University's law faculty. And our third speaker this evening is Dr. Mona Jeffries. Mona is a senior research fellow in epidemiology at Victoria University. She trained at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she previously worked in academic roles at Massey University and the University of Bristol. The main focus of her work is equity in health, social determinants of health, and access to primary health care. But before moving to our next speakers, I would like to share with you some reflections I prepared on the role of human rights perspective that plays in the COVID and climate change era. Human rights offer an important legal and ethical perspective to understand the causes and consequences of the COVID-19 and climate change crisis. Both don't only coincide, but are deeply linked to the structural flaws in our societies. Globalization has proven to be an existential threat to our Earth system and global health, which ultimately make these human rights concerns. Hence, human rights envisage transformative action based on care and solidarity to mitigate the impact of this overlapping crisis while protecting human dignity in the process. The pandemic and climate change crisis have exacerbated human rights violations in many parts of the world, both in developed and developing nations. The socioeconomic impacts of this crisis have also exacerbated poverty and marginalization worldwide. The human rights implications of climate change and the pandemic demands international solidarity above and beyond the minimum threshold for humanitarian and official development assistance. Never has the need for human rights-based approach for social protection been more urgent as now, including in our use of technologies like AI, big data, and machine learning. But again, these require a fundamental grounding in human rights. As the Declaration signed 72 years ago laid down, all human beings have rights. As the pandemic and the environmental change have shown, whether you are rich or poor, young or old, we are all vulnerable. Therefore, governments must work to ensure that people are covered throughout their lives, placing dignity at the core of any social protection system. A human rights perspective can play a transformative role in correcting the injustices associated with the impacts of this crisis, both in the Pacific and elsewhere, and provide opportunities for realizing a sustainable and inclusive future. The pandemic and climate change have made it more evident than ever before how interconnected we are as human beings, people on one planet. From a human rights perspective, it is impossible to overstate the importance of these global connections. But now, coming back to our speakers. So, Nathan, our next speaker, will discuss the parallels between the responses to COVID-19 and climate change. With COVID-19, New Zealand and other countries have demonstrated that we can live in accordance with the demands that nature throws our way. Nathan will explain some of the real and humbling lessons we can learn from climate change. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nathan Ross with a warm round of applause.
Good evening, everyone, and my sincere thanks to the UN Association for the invitation to contribute this evening. I'm going to depart slightly from what the introduction said I would talk about tonight. I've been asked to discuss primarily how we might rethink our relationship with the environment in the contexts of climate change and human rights. And as a case study, I'm going to focus on the situation where people are forced to migrate as a consequence of climate change. And I have three key messages. The first is an old but not yet embraced idea, which is that we are in the environment and not separate from it. Secondly, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a context in which we live and make decisions. Thirdly, human rights risks associated with climate change are vast, and this is exemplified by the impacts on people displaced by climate change. Before getting started, I'd like to highlight that the question of rethinking our relationship with nature is not one that every community needs to ask itself. There are communities, especially Indigenous communities, whose cultures, cosmologies, and ways of life already reflect a healthy relationship with nature. So this is a question that is really aimed at what might loosely be described as Western cultures or liberal economies. If I was to ask you to picture the environment in our minds, we might think of scenes like Milford Sound, or perhaps we would think locally of Zealandia and its resident Takahe. It is true, of course, that such things are part of the environment. But when we think of those sorts of things as the environment, it is something else, something out there, and we perceive ourselves as disconnected from it in our everyday lives. And depending on your perspective, this other world might be something to be enjoyed and conserved, or it might be something to be bought or exploited. But we Homo sapiens, intelligent primates, according to the internet, are in and part of the environment. My talk tonight would be better titled Opportunities to Rethink Our Place in the Environment rather than our relationship with it. The false separation of humans from nature was popularised in the Sustainable Development Discourse, which followed the report of the World Commission on the Environment in 1987. Even today, more than 30 years later, sustainable development is still often presented graphically as three circles: economy, society, environment. At a pinch, you might see a Venn diagram where there's a slight overlap, but that's about as ambitious as it gets. Conceptually, at least, the international community has moved past this. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development states up front, and I quote, "The interlinkages and integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals are of crucial importance." The 17 SDGs, just here, deal with a wide range of fundamentals: poverty, hunger, health, gender equality, decent work, and climate change, to name a few. Policies and projects on any one of these issues will almost certainly affect others, and so that fact needs to be built into our work. These interrelationships reflect the fact that the environment is something we live in and are reliant upon, and this is perhaps no more obvious than when we consider climate change. In my experience, people sometimes think of climate change as just another environmental issue, as if the impacts of climate change will be as discrete as, for example, a mammal going extinct. Such extinctions are tragic moral failings, absolutely, but their impacts on humanity are very limited compared to climate change. So let me now turn to climate change as an environmental problem and as more than an environmental problem. For humanity, arguably the most important macro-scale impact of climate change is how it affects the hydrological cycle. Remember back to school, the hydrological cycle involves water storage systems such as the ocean, polar caps, forests, groundwater, and so on. It involves processes of evaporation, condensation, and rainfall, and it involves events like storms and droughts. As global warming heats the ocean and the atmosphere, it's interfering with every single part of that hydrological cycle. For us in the Pacific, at the moment at least, we perceive that the most significant of these problems are sea level rise and the increasing frequency or intensity of extreme events, especially cyclones, flooding and droughts. For sea level rise, it's causing salt water to pollute freshwater supplies and to pollute agricultural soils. It's also drowning marine ecosystems that are important for fisheries breeding habitats, mangroves, coral reefs, that sort of thing. These are already observed impacts. And adding to those sea level rise problems, as extreme events like cyclones become more frequent or more intense, we have less time to recover, or we have more to recover from. So our vulnerability increases over time. All of these sorts of environmental issues are impacting on the human rights of people right now. For example, direct mortality and injury from extreme events, compromised health from water and food security, to name just a few critical ones. And then there are mental health challenges associated with disaster events and the chronic uncertainties of staring down the barrel at a climate change future. Again, these are all observed impacts that are already happening. The combined effect of all of these climate change symptoms is that they can overwhelm people's and communities' resilience and force them into decisions about whether to relocate. And that's the next suite of human rights impacts. So just to emphasise there, climate change has its own human rights impacts, and then mitigation measures and adaptation measures can also have their own human rights impacts. So looking at climate migration, in lifestyle migration, people can end up better off. But climate migration is a form of what's known in the literature as forced relocation, and that is in a completely different scenario. How is climate migration forced migration? By and large, people do not want to be forced to leave their homes. Think about this locally for a moment. Look slightly up the coast and you'll see that people do not want to be forced to leave their home to make way for a highway. Look a little further north and you will find people who do not want to be forced to leave their home because they're now more prone to landslips. Look south and you will find people who do not want to move because they are now more prone to floods. Now, don't get me wrong, these people have legitimate concerns very often. But adding to those sorts of concerns, in Pacific Island countries, we are talking about land that is held under customary title, which has been in the family for many generations, which has many generations living on it, which has many generations buried on it. It's land that people know how to use and manage sustainably. If they have to move, these are all the things they have to consider giving up. The research into the impacts of forced relocation has found wide-ranging human rights impacts, and I'm going to give you a fulsome list to paint a clear picture. 7 things here. In forced relocation, People lose their land, their base for productive and commercial activity. When they lose their home, they also lose an important cultural space and traditional setting. 3, they can have prolonged challenges with unemployment and underemployment. In turn, that can lead to children, especially girls, being taken out of school to help with running the home. They can suffer social, economic and psychological marginalisation. The impacts of the psychological stresses of COVID has already been discussed in terms of gender-based violence, and the same sort of thing in disaster scenarios. These forms of marginalisation are also experienced more acutely by already marginalised communities, as the Minister has referred. For people who rely on subsistence or micro-scale agriculture, and this is the 5th impact, food becomes more insecure, and the skills that they had for their own land may not translate to their new land. Their skills become redundant and they have to learn how to work new land, and that's not an overnight process. 6, they can lose access to common property that belonged to the whole community. This can include such things as the sea and natural resources. It can include public sector infrastructure like schools that operate in ways that reflect their values, their priorities, their ways of doing things. And then finally, communities can become fragmented, and that undermines the informal, interpersonal, reciprocal relationships that are relied on for social organisation and social capital that enables social, cultural and economic life. This is quite a list of risks. People who are forced to relocate may not experience all of these problems, but it is extremely likely that they will experience some or many of them. And what about the communities into which they move? If the relocating community has to move just 100 metres away from new coastal hazards, there may not be any freehold land that they can buy because it's all under customary title. They may be looking at a neighbouring community's customary land. There's a negotiation process to be done, and there may be long-running disputes that need to be resolved. And there will be a lot of potential for new disputes. Competition for land, for jobs, for access to public investment and public services, for share at the local markets, and crucially, competition for culture. Similar triggers for dispute will exist where people have to move across international borders. What would be the view of New Zealanders if, for example, we decided to support people from the region moving here? If what people wanted was to live their traditional lives here, would we enable that? Would we even allow it? Would someone who operates outside the formal economy be tolerated, or is that tax avoidance? These are the kinds of policy questions we need to be thinking through. For some countries, their entire territories may become uninhabitable. Would we accommodate the state? As we think about these sorts of questions, it's worth remembering that Pacific Islanders bear absolutely no responsibility whatsoever for the climate crisis. There is a massive justice issue here. So how do we respond fairly and effectively? I'm going to have to leave that big question hanging because of time. But the wider issue here is that climate change isn't just another environmental issue. It impacts on the human rights of people in our region today. And those impacts are both vast and increasing. In turn, that highlights that the environment is not separate from us. It is a critical context of our lives and the decisions that we make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That was an excellent presentation that we can take valuable insight from, especially in regards to the human rights, but also political implications of climate change migration. So now our final speaker is Dr. Mona Jeffries. Mona will talk about the opportunities for addressing the coincidental crisis of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically leadership and a shift to system thinking. Mona will speak about these opportunities, drawing examples from climate and global health crisis. Please join me in welcoming Mona with also a big applause.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Te me tuatahi e te rangatira James Shaw, tēnā koe. Ki koe e hoki Nathan Ross, tēnā koe. Ngā mihi nui, kia korua. Ki oki hoa mahi o te he rangawaka, kia ora koutou, ko Mona Jeffries, tōku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers of the Hui, so thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, to Paula, and also many thanks to Peter and to Wendy, who I'm sure was involved as well. So I'm very pleased to be sharing some thoughts with you on the intersection between the climate crisis and the pandemic crisis. Although I am delighted to be here, I must admit that neither of these are my topics of expertise, and I'd like to acknowledge the very many knowledgeable and articulate people whose writing has informed this presentation. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in the 75th anniversary year of the UN, and we're here to celebrate the 72nd anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would also like to recognise this year we celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Aotearoa New Zealand adopting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and of course the 180th anniversary of the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So in this talk I'm going to show some of the links and parallels between the climate and pandemic crises through which we're living. Throughout I'm going to focus on equity, which is the impetus for and the focus of my research. I'm then going to present a few ideas of possible opportunities for the future to end on a hopeful note. Climate change and global health are largely treated as completely separate issues by the public, the media, policymakers, and politicians. I argue that we cannot study the impact of one without acknowledging the impact of the other. In the same way that causes and consequences of the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic are interwoven, so must global policy and political response also be. The impacts of the climate crisis in Aotearoa New Zealand are evident to everyone. We've had in recent years an increase in severe weather events. It's very clear to see the effect of rising sea levels and melting glaciers. And as Nathan clearly described, in the Pacific, the threat to human habitation is much more immediate. Again, there's been an increase in severe weather events and rising sea levels, but the possibility of running out of fresh water is the most real and imminent threat. This cannot be ignored, and developed countries should be exceeding their Paris Climate Agreement goals to protect Pacific nations. Following the admirable leadership of Greta Thunberg, it was just over a year ago that 170,000 school students and supporters took part in the school strike for climate, demanding that the government take significant action on climate change. In the space of a few short months, this momentum was lost from the media and the images with which we became more familiar with these. It's exciting to be speaking just a week after the New Zealand government declared a climate change emergency. Declaring an emergency is strong in name and requires strong action to follow. In March 2020, as the seriousness of the COVID-19 threat became clear, the Prime Minister vowed to go hard and go early and do everything we can to protect New Zealanders' health. We're all aware that we've missed the boat to go early to address climate change, but I would urge the current government to apply the go hard approach to the climate crisis. We should be investing in now, for example, improved public transport instead of road infrastructure, e-transport, local food production. Not only will these sorts of actions help address the climate crisis, there will be resulting improvements in population health, which will help avert some of the impacts of future pandemics. To protect ourselves, we need to be in the best state of health. I now want to think about some of the links between the climate crisis and pandemics with a focus on COVID-19. This scheme shows just a few of the examples of commonalities between the two crises. Large-scale deforestation is a key driver in global increasing levels of carbon dioxide. There's also a clear link between deforestation and virus emergence. The resulting change in habitat brings wild animals in closer proximity with human habitation, allowing spread of viruses from animals to humans. Astoundingly, an average of 2 animal viruses per year over the last 100 years have caused disease outbreaks in humans. And these examples of zoonoses have become more frequent in recent years. Increased globalization and population movement is both a cause and a consequence of climate change. The 1918 pandemic spread as rapidly as it did along sea and rail routes due to the mobilization of soldiers. The 2020 pandemic had spread by international air travel before it was even recognized as a threat. Climate change directly affects COVID-19. Higher levels of air pollution are associated with higher transmissibility of the virus and higher mortality from the disease. This puts pressure on our health system, and as we've seen throughout the world, in the face of a pandemic, health systems cannot cope. Acute weather events, including hurricanes, wildfires, and floodings, have impacted the COVID-19 response. The strategies used to mitigate the human impact of such events include evacuation, mass sheltering, and population movement, each of which increases the risk of transmission of COVID-19. A further concern of population movement is to regions of high population density, for example in refugee camps. There are concerns that increasingly we will see outbreaks in such camps where overcrowding and a lack of basic sanitation will mean they are virtually impossible to control. For example, in the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, home to 1 million Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, it's estimated that a COVID-19 outbreak would overwhelm the health service in just 58 days. The poor quality of the housing stock in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with little insulation, contributes to our carbon emission load. Cold, damp housing is also associated with lower levels of health, which will contribute to the impact of COVID-19, whether to be a significant community spread here, both directly and indirectly. In summary, the causes and consequences of climate change increase the risk and impact of pandemics. The Lancet's Commission on COVID-19 highlights the importance of rebuilding the world's economy in a way that is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. We cannot address each crisis in isolation, and governments' responses to one must align with the other. I'd like to shift our thinking now to equity, and just as a quick reminder, when we talk about equity, we're not talking about equality. We are by definition talking about justice and human rights. An unequal situation requires an unequal response to achieve equity. There's very good evidence that the most vulnerable in society bear a disproportionate burden of both climate change and COVID-19. The pandemic is exacerbating existing social and economic inequities relating to food insecurity, health and well-being, social protection, access to healthcare and education. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, much of this burden will be borne by Māori. As shown in this figure, there are many reasons why those who are socially vulnerable, including people on low incomes, Indigenous people, and those from other minority ethnic groups, are likely to have a higher risk of contracting COVID-19, lower access to healthcare, and hence worse COVID-19 outcomes. Importantly, many of these same factors mean that these groups will also bear the brunt of the climate crisis. Addressing inequity needs to be at the forefront of every country's COVID-19 response. And it's important to remember that this means different interventions or policies may be needed for different groups of people. A one-size-fits-all approach will only perpetuate existing inequity. I hesitate to quote Henry Ford, but I'm going to. If we always do what we've always done, we will always get what we've always got. We need to change our approach. In terms of parallels with the climate crisis, Māori identity is intimately linked to the natural environment, and this was touched on very nicely by Nathan. Thank you. There's very good evidence that iwi and hapu know how to protect their people. What needs to be done is the giving of power, with funding, to the people who are best able to help their whānau. To echo a call made at a conference hosted by Te Herenga Haora a few weeks ago, we should put our money on the table and walk away. I'm going to come back to expand on this idea of localized leadership shortly. So I now want to think about opportunities for the future. There's three key sources of opportunity that I see for addressing the coincidental and interlinked crises of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. These are evidence, leadership, and systems thinking. And overarching each of these, there must be a focus on equity. As scientists, our work is embedded in evidence. But this is being threatened by misinformation, which has been propagated by some world leaders, and it's been come to known as medical populism. The Lancet Commission on COVID-19 explicitly calls on Joe Biden to reverse Donald Trump's decision to withdraw from the WHO, the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as UNESCO and UNHCR. Misinformation in the media and social media is not restricted to leaders. And I thought I would just show you these quotes taken from Facebook. A recent poll by the Asthma and Respiratory Foundation of New Zealand asked, if a vaccine was available, would you take it? Although some of the comments were reassuring, such as, yes, vaccines save lives, and yes, borders won't stay shut forever, there's a considerable degree of misinformation and mistrust of information. You've got to be kidding. The vaccine could only have been developed in that time frame if it had been developed already. Not if it comes from America. I don't trust America. No way. It takes years and years of research, trial and error. We will not be their guinea pigs. Wake up, people. I find these extremely worrying, bearing in mind that these quotes are coming from people with chronic respiratory disease. Those at the coalface of public health and working in public health policy have their work cut out to get high levels of population vaccine coverage. I was a student of epidemiology when Andrew Wakefield and colleagues published their research on the purported relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism. The ramifications of this are still being felt 22 years later. I urge strong political action to ensure that any vaccination programme is grounded in evidence and that the promising vaccines are available first to those who need it most. This may mean ensuring, for example, that health workers and those most at risk in Pacific nations are guaranteed vaccines before some of those of us who live here who are lucky to be healthy, the affluent and healthy public of Aotearoa, New Zealand. A more insidious threat to evidence is what's becoming known as the commercial developments of health. These are defined as factors that influence health which stem from a motive for profit. And here we must include not only players which directly determine human health, but also those which affect planetary health. These commercial determinants include, for example, producers of harmful products, such as the alcohol and tobacco industries, but also corporate and political influences, market economies, and globalization. As stated in the 2016 Vienna Declaration on Public Health, which was a 30-year renewal of the Ottawa Charter, it is essential to recognize the growing role of diverse, non-state actors, and especially the importance of distinguishing those that pursue public interest objectives from those that pursue commercial objectives, paying particular attention to the difficulties that can arise with activities promoted as corporate social responsibility. In summary, we need to continue and strengthen the fight against misinformation and ensure that our response to the pandemic and climate crisis is rooted in evidence. I'd now like to just briefly address leadership. We can be proud in Aotearoa, New Zealand, of the visible leadership we've had during the COVID-19 response and the current government's recent commitment to addressing climate change through the declaration of the climate emergency. On the global stage, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern received acclaim for her strong leadership. The level of popular support she received through the various crises in her first term as Prime Minister assured her and her party a second term in government. However, we cannot overlook and increasingly must utilise what I term localised leadership. It's important that we have leadership at many levels, and to truly achieve this, we need to put trust in the leadership that is locally owned and accountable. Local leaders will come from the communities which they serve. During the COVID-19 lockdown, there were many examples of local leadership, particularly led by Māori for Māori communities. It was quickly recognised that the lockdown would affect the poorest in society first, and many groups mobilised to address the social determinants of health. One example of this response was Kokore Marae in Lower Hutt, delivering food parcels and providing health and social services throughout lockdown. Similar responses were seen up and down the country. A number of iwi protected the borders to the Rohe to minimise regional spread. This was Tino Rangatiratanga in practice. To ensure this is replicated in the future response to COVID-19 and climate crises, there needs to be trust. High-level leadership needs to put trust in communities, to allow a locality approach to devolve power and resources to communities. Importantly, we need a Māori voice integrated throughout, and Māori as decision makers, not just at the table. When I say this, I mean we need to truly put our trust in Māori leaders. This has not happened previously. Very early in the COVID-19 response in March 2020, influential Māori leaders, academics and health professionals came together to form Te Rōpū Whakakaupapa Uruta, the Māori Pandemic Group. Although the Ministry of Health has consulted with this group, the level of engagement was not sufficient. As quoted by Dr. Alana Curtis, we need to really allow the communities and whānau to be empowered. A mana-enhancing and treaty-compliant approach would actually allow the solution to come from the Māori and Pacific communities and not be mandated from the top. To summarise, I endorse strong leadership, complemented by putting trust in local leaders. I also believe that local government has a strong role to play here. Finally, I'd like to describe the advantages of a systems approach to addressing the climate and pandemic crises. A Centre of Research Excellence, Te Pūnaha Matatini, is driving novel thinking in this area. I've cheekily borrowed their logo. Although I'm a novice in this field, I'm really excited by the prospect that this intersectoral and pivotal approach can bring. We know only too well that when opportunities for health, such as vaccinations, are offered, it is those who need it most that are least likely to be able to benefit. And just because I'm an epidemiologist, I couldn't give a talk without showing a graph. So the data here show the proportion of Māori and non-Māori who've received all the recommended infant vaccinations at age 8 months. In 2012, so at the beginning of the graph, this was about 83% for Tamariki Māori and 91% for non-Māori children. With intensive outreach immunisation programmes, by 2014, these figures were 90% and 93% respectively. Having nearly closed the gap, interventions were scaled back, with the result that by 2018, the proportion of Tamariki Māori who were fully vaccinated was the same as it had been in 2012. And yet non-Māori families maintained the benefit that they had received, resulting in the equity gap being even greater. This gives strong evidence to show that we need to reorientate our systems towards local communities, rather than assuming a one-size-fits-all approach will work. A systems approach aims to reconfigure systems to achieve the desired outcomes. Based on the work of Dana Meadows, we need to understand the leverage points in a complex system. These are points at which a small shift can have significant impacts. As a very simple example, based on the current pandemic, the provision of PPE for healthcare workers, followed by masks for the public, and an effective track and trace system for infected or potentially infected people. Each of these is a relatively small and simple action in itself, but can have important and considerable knock-on effects to the system as a whole. If we do not consider problems from a systems point of view, interventions will be piecemeal and scattergun with less effective outcomes. It's also important to remember that inequity is ingrained throughout our social systems, and a systems approach to addressing inequity is also needed. Just as an example, Healthy Families New Zealand is a policy that aims to improve people's health and uses a systems approach, drawing on community leadership to achieve this. The premise of this work is that there needs to be a move away from these piecemeal, time-limited interventions for communities to reorientate towards health-promoting systems. This involves a change across a whole range of settings, moving health promotion out of the health sector, involving support for change, for example, at early childhood education in schools, workplaces and businesses, sports clubs, marae, places of worship and food outlets. The whole of community approach is a new way to commission health promotion, and the role of local government will be key to the success of this local implementation. The intersection between the climate crisis and global health is not a new phenomenon. In 2015, the Public Health Institute Centre for Climate Change and Health published a call for action, which is pertinent to the collision of crises in which we find ourselves today. They stated, climate change, health, environmental health, health equity, social justice, environmental justice, and sustainability are each hugely important and complex issues in their own right. But we can't afford to address them separately. The stakes are too high. The need for action is too urgent. There are too many opportunities for synergy. I'd like to end in the words of René Salas, as she recently wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine. She says, until there's a vaccine and until vaccines are globally available, the climate crisis will challenge our pandemic responses. Beyond the pandemic, the climate crisis will continue to pose existential risks. It is past time to implement robust and equitable responses to both. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much. Mona, that was an insightful presentation that got a lot of relevant takeaways from, especially on the opportunities for effective and decisive response to the COVID and climate change crisis. So now, with this, we complete presentations, and I want to invite all of you to join a conversation with our speakers.
Tēnā koutou, and thank you very much to the speakers. My question is possibly to Minister Shaw in terms of our responsibilities to the Pacific Realm nations. Should there be a need to relocate, as other speakers had spoken to, what are our responsibilities and obligations to our Pacific Realm brothers and sisters, should that occur as a result of climate change?
I'm actually going to divert that one to Nathan, because he's just written a PhD thesis on that exact topic, and was awarded his PhD last night, actually, so congratulations, Nathan. And it is something that we're actually still working out. We have started a work program in 2017 over quite a long period of time, but the issue that we've got is that, as Nathan said, people don't want to move. Why would they? And so we have to be led, because we want to be led by the Pacific Island nations themselves, that the view that's been quite strongly represented to us is there is plan A, and that is stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and causing climate change, and there is no plan B. It's just that, that we do not want to, we do not want to allow for the possibility, because allowing for the possibility essentially is an admission of defeat. And so it's a very sensitive conversation that we're in. But I'll give Nathan the floor on the specifics.
Yes, it is a very difficult question, and there is a lot of pushback, as the Minister has said, about people not wanting to relocate. On the flip side, we also do need to think about the risks that this may eventuate, and we need to have a plan. We need to be thoughtful about what that plan is intended to achieve. So my research was specifically about the right of self-determination in international law, and so that would mean that if New Zealand was to look at a situation involving Rome countries or other Pacific countries, then that would be decisions and processes that would be led by the affected people as a matter of exercising their right to self-determination. So in terms of what New Zealand's response would be, well, that's to be determined, of course, but it would need to be, in my view, it would need to be very strongly driven by the express wishes of the peoples of the realm countries. Again, having said that, it will ultimately be a political negotiation process, because obviously New Zealand has interests in that conversation. So it would need to be a negotiated process. And there's no way of speculating really what that would lead to. My hope is that because we, as a country, do have already, we have diaspora communities here in New Zealand, and we have systems in place to support Pacifica communities to a greater or lesser degree, as the graphs show, but that we do have something to build on. And I would hope that New Zealand would be putting that lens on it as we enter those discussions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's fascinating. However, it seems to me, my name's Pereda-Perez, by the way, it seems to me an elephant in the room throughout, I mean, you were talking about globalization having its major impact and something that we have to mitigate now in terms of its impact. And you were talking about systems change, very specifically about perhaps a health system or the systems that are struggling need systems change. But it seems to me the major elephant in the room is the capitalist system and the growth objective of our late capitalist economy, which is at odds with health and safety in the workplace, to say the least. But our whole objective of having more of a holistic outlook to saving our planet. So I just wonder if you've got, specifically you, Minister, are you still the Associate Minister of Finance, and what kind of systems change can New Zealand try to lead and wield in terms of capitalist economy and fair trade relations perhaps? What is possible there in terms of halting the growth objective so that we can actually get on with saving this planet?
How long do I have? So no, I'm no longer an Associate Minister of Finance. One of the results of the election, or one of the perceived results of the election, was a mandate to ensure that the Greens were parked up nowhere near economic policy, precisely because we kept saying the sort of things that you've just said, and so, which turned out to be popular with a very small number of people. But the my sort of view of it is that, capitalism is changing, has over time in the past, it is currently at the moment. And one of the responsibilities I think that we have is to take every opportunity that we can to nudge it more towards what I would describe as a steady state economy in terms of the throughput of material and resources, and one that is actually inclusive rather than exclusive of all people. And there are things that we are doing and have done to kind of reshape it, if you like, rather than replace it. So, for example, just not long before the election, we announced that we would be requiring the financial sector and listed companies to start reporting on their climate-related risks. Now, that's actually a pure capitalist play. The idea there is that if investors have full information, then they will allocate their capital to the place with the lowest risk and the highest return. That has been described as possibly the single most transformational thing that we did in the last term. I mean, we actually still have to legislate for it, but it'll be in place by the time the next election rolls around. And what that means is that you will start to see carbon-intensive businesses start to struggle with access to capital, and those that can innovate and work out how to produce goods and services for people with a much, much lower, or ideally a zero carbon footprint, will have much easier access to capital in order to invest in those things. That doesn't replace the capitalist system, but it does reshape it and dramatically reduce the harm that is caused under the status quo. I think of it as capitalism jiu-jitsu, where you take the energy that's coming towards you and you flip it on its bum.
That's not jiu-jitsu. That's Jumanji or something else. Jiu-jitsu.
Hello, my name is Debbie Mayer. Thank you for speaking today. Dr. Nathan Ross, that was amazing. Because I think sometimes we forget about the climate refugees and the climate migrants, and that at the moment they're all over the world. So I put this to you. Minister. Why are we not using the systems that we already have? When I think in terms of Rocket Lab and we're putting satellites in the sky, why are we not using those satellites to tell us where the carbon emissions and the methane is within our country and where the issues are going to be before they actually occur in terms of erosion and sedimentation within New Zealand?
I have some good news. We actually are. So last year the government invested, I think, $30 million in something called Methane Sat, which is it's actually a global partnership project to measure methane emissions from space and to be able to pinpoint their sources, not just biogenic, but also from oil and gas platforms and things like that, and to be able to pinpoint that much more accurately than we've been able to in the past. And we will soon be able to do the same with gases, other gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and so on. And so that just forms part of the data and the evidence base that we have for policy decisions.
Hi, thank you to all the speakers. That was a very interesting talk. My question was just wanting to hear your thoughts really on this sort of paradox, I think, between sort of some of the sustainable development goals that require sort of quite a globalistic approach and a rules-based system versus the challenges that poses with something like COVID-19, where and climate change actually, where globalism can actually be sort of an exacerbating factor. So how do we sort of reconcile the ideals of globalism with some of the obvious negative effects that we've seen lately?
I'd be interested, I guess, in an example of what you're specifically thinking about. I can think of some examples in mind. I think of the weaknesses of the multilateral system perhaps in a not exactly the same way that you're thinking of. But there's a strong, for a start, the multilateral system applies voluntarily. So international, with some exceptions, international law applies to states that sign those treaties. So there are states that can fall outside of that system. That's an issue when we're dealing with global commons problems like climate change. And then there's a lot of ambiguity in the treaties. So in the Paris Agreement, there's now a Paris Agreement rulebook, almost completed. I'll let you discuss that, don't go there, which fleshes out a lot of the detail. But a lot of those treaties are written with a lot of what's described as strategic ambiguity, so that states can potentially comply with zero or minimal effort. And obviously that's a real problem. That's all the downside of it. The upside of it is that the Paris Agreement in particular initially had every single country sign up to it. And I think that's potentially unprecedented. It certainly came into force in record time in terms of countries ratifying it. So irrespective of its bindingness, international law's got relative degrees of bindingness, irrespective of that, it was a massive line in the sand which changed investment patterns, changed policy patterns, changed the discourse around the discussion. And in the country where I'm originally from, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about what the change in government in the US means for domestic climate change policy there. So, and a lot of that is led by other countries putting pressure. So I think that strengths and weaknesses, and there are very strong parts of international law, particularly around trade law, but environmental law has those generalisation problems. But to think optimistically about it, I still think it was a line in the sand that changed the tone, and in very important ways. But maybe the Minister might have a different view on that. Yeah, leave it there? Okay, sure. Does that answer your question now? I'm not exactly sure. Yep.
Thank you for the presentation. Human rights include access to health. With COVID-19, in New Zealand are waiting for the vaccine. And also with the lockdown, our tourism is affected. So in your opinion, when we have a vaccine, say sometime next year, how long would it take for us to restart economy? What is your opinion?
That would be a guess. That would be a complete guess if I tried to put a time frame on that. I mean, I think in terms of the right to healthcare access being a human right, I absolutely agree with that, and it's clearly one of the Sustainable Development Goals, number 3. I think that, I mean, there obviously was a lot of talk around the legalities of lockdown, and that I'm sure you followed all that in the media at the time for New Zealand. I guess the most important thing is that we are balancing human rights. There's clearly there's a right to health as well as healthcare, and I think once the vaccine is vaccines are rolled out, we still don't know if they're going to work very well. They work in the short term, but we have no idea how well that's going to work this time next year, this time in 5 years' time. We don't really know the impact those vaccines are going to have. And so the vaccines are actually only going to be one part of the global response, I think. And I think we all talk about learning to live with COVID rather than beat it. But in terms of putting a time frame on the economy restarting again, I wouldn't like to try to do that.
I mean, you'll notice that every projection that we had for the economy under COVID was completely wrong. It had its upsides and downsides as it's gone. But I think the thing I wanted to say is, in terms of the right to health, actually our entire response was built around the right to health. The fact that we closed the borders and adopted an elimination strategy was a right to health approach that was absent a vaccine. So the speed at which we're able to roll out a vaccine isn't fulfilling a right that we weren't previously fulfilling. It's just fulfilling that right in a different way, i.e. via a vaccine rather than via a closed border and an elimination strategy. How you deliver on those rights will vary based on circumstances. I think in Aotearoa our approach will be, as fast as possible and no faster. One of the questions that we are going to have to grapple with is, because we were so successful in eliminating COVID-19 from within our borders, in a world where it's getting rolled out, should the team of 5 million take one for the team of 9 billion and allow it to roll, to essentially forego receiving it as fast as it could be delivered in order to ensure it gets faster to other countries where the impact is more severe, and where actually they haven't had an elimination strategy and people's lives are being lost on a daily basis. So those, in terms of balancing human rights, those are some of the decisions that Cabinet will have to grapple with once we get to a scenario where we are able to think about those things, and we're actually not there yet.
We are getting close to our end, so I'm going to give a chance for a couple of questions, these last ones.
I think you're right, Minister, in that we did incredibly well in our response to COVID because we had the community approach. We had a leader who, the polls showed that the majority of the country trusted her and trusted Dr. Bloomfield. So we got on board with the idea of needing to address COVID. Is the public mandate there to deal with the climate crisis? Are we still having to work on education at every level in terms of really getting the public to really understand how desperate this is? Or do you think we can act now, or are we needing more education first?
I think absolutely we need more education. In fact, Rod Carr, the chair of the Climate Change Commission, said so fairly recently. He thinks that we need a sustained, highly visible public information campaign over a number of years, as we have with road safety or smoking, to be able to both build the social license to communicate why it is that we need to do what it is that we need to do, and also what we are doing in response. And so, having said all of that, the COVID response was effective also in part because at the moment that there was a moment in time, we had a window, which was quite a short window, of going to level 4 lockdown. If we had gone any earlier, we probably wouldn't have had the social license to do it because people weren't worried enough. If we'd gone any later, it would have been out of control. So we probably had maybe 72 hours remaining to us before we had the J-stick curve in front of us. But if we'd gone 72 hours earlier, people's level of concern wasn't sufficiently high that we felt that we would have gotten any compliance. So in addition to the various epidemiological advice that we were receiving, we were also receiving sociological advice as well. And trying to get that balance right was important. And humans, I think, as a result of our evolution, have extremely effective ways of responding to a clear and present danger. And we are evolutionarily hopeless at distributed, invisible, long-term threats like climate change. So in order to be able to overcome what is basically a cognitive disorder to deal with these things, I think that some form of sustained education campaign is probably the only way that we will be able to do that. The exception to that is that because climate change manifests as a series of civil defence emergencies of increasing severity and frequency, that short-term response that people have may give us the license to deal with the kind of significant longer-term transformation that needs to take place. The problem with that is that you're basically banking on a series of disasters, and that's not my first preference when it comes to communications campaigns.
Any last question? All right.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your talks. My question's mainly for the minister, but I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on this. As Minister for Climate Change, you're essentially the minister for a specific existential risk. And I was wondering if there's anything you would learn from being the minister for an existential risk that could be applied if we perhaps set up an organization or a ministerial role dedicated to risks from future pandemics.
I'm going to struggle to sleep at night now. Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think enables us to keep going and to have some hope is by actually being part of the solution, right? So, I mean, there are calls for a pandemic agency. I think, I mean, to tell you the honest truth, I actually think the lessons are flowing in the other direction. You know, for example, 2020 was the year that we learned in no uncertain terms to listen to the scientists. It would have been good if we'd learned that lesson 30 years ago when it came to climate change. So, you know, many of the parallels, you know, while imperfect, are quite strong in terms of, you know, how well we've done in responding to a pandemic and being able to say, well, there's another curve that we need to bend as well. Let's basically apply the same set of lessons there, be led by the science, communicate, you know, strongly and well, engage people as a community in the effort, and so on.
So therefore, I'd like to conclude this event with a word of thanks. So today we have been privileged to hear from many stellar experts on rights in the face of COVID-19 and the global climate crisis, challenges and opportunities for the Pacific region. I thank Honorable James Shaw, Dr. Nathan Ross, and Dr. Mona Jeffreys for making the time and effort to mark this occasion and to provide their insights. I also acknowledge and thank our event coordinator, Wendy Hart, for making this event happen. The United Nations Association of New Zealand Special Officer of Human Rights, Dr. Paula Pereda-Perez, and Special Officer Climate Change, Ivan Shirinov, for planning for this event, and for all the other components that result in the seminar coming to a successful conclusion. I think we can all agree that the goals of this seminar to offer an opportunity to reflect on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights has been met. On behalf of the United Nations Association of New Zealand, we also like to take this opportunity to thank our President, Peter Nichols, for his amazing leadership, hard work, and support for the past 2.5 years leading this organization. 2.5 years? Yeah. We are extremely proud to be led by a talented, driven, enthusiastic, and funny person like you, Peter. And congratulations on your retirement. And we wish you all the best in your new phase of your life. So I now invite you to show your appreciation. I conclude this event. I conclude this event with a whakatoke. Mate rongo ko mohio, mate mohio ka marama, mate marama ka matau, mate matau ka ora ai tiwi. Through listening comes awareness, through awareness comes understanding, through understanding comes knowledge, through knowledge comes well-being. Thank you.